So last time we delved into the dungeons of Azeroth, but when we left off I said we really can't do them until we get a group together, and it's not as simple as just inviting 4 more people to a party and rolling out. There's a lot to consider. Especially if you're new to MMOs, this stuff will be really important to know, especially if you plan on making or leading groups into dungeons. And I mean, groups don't just make themselves, that would be silly. So let's talk about grouping up. So now that we know what dungeons are and we have seen them all very briefly, we need to get a group of people together to do them. We'll let it be known just beforehand, there are a ton of quests and areas that are independent of dungeons that also need to be done in a group due to their difficulty. Whether you're actually doing a dungeon or an elite quest, or you just want to do something faster or more efficiently, you're gonna want to form a group first. Now, the most organic way people group up is by being near the same area, trying to do the same thing and noticing each other and saying, hey, wanna group up? But if you're preparing beforehand, your first step would have to be advertising for it. So typing /1 to talk in general chat and saying LFG this dungeon or this quest. But let's talk about what exactly you're looking for. I mean, who do you want in your group and why does that matter? If we're looking to fill all slots in our 5-man party, what do we need or want to look for? As this is a true role-playing game, one of the core design principles is having group roles. The most basic, most common, I'd say even inherent system to have in a game like this is what we call the Holy Trinity: DPS, healer, and tank. DPS stands for damage per second. Their job is to kill things. They make things die. The healer, well, heals. They directly prevent your team from dying. If you come from other games that use the term support, let me say I'm intentionally not using that term because that's not what this role is. I'll explain that later. And finally, the tank takes all the damage, ideally. Specifically, the tank's job is not really to do damage, but it's also not to just stand there and be hard to kill. The tank's main focus is to gain aggro or threat. So, when fighting an NPC, whichever party member has the highest amount of threat with that NPC will be the character that NPC attacks. Dealing damage inherently gives you threat with the NPC that you attack, so the DPS needs to be careful that they don't do too much damage and overtake the tank in threat. As long as you have a good tank, this is almost never a problem until, say, raiding. So the DPS depend on the tank so that they can do their job, the tank depends on the healer so that it can do its job, and the healer depends on the DPS so that the healer can do its job. See? A Holy Trinity. So if we have 5 slots in a normal party, how do we fill them up? Well, judging by my use of plurality in the past couple of sentences, you can infer correctly that the general team composition will be 1 tank, 1 healer, and 3 DPS. Oh, don't worry, there's definitely more to building a team than just that. That's just a general rule. We have many different ways of building our team because there are 9 different classes in the game. Each class has its own kit of spells and abilities that make it unique. Let's talk about which classes fill which roles and their pros and cons. First, we'll start with the tanks. During leveling and in dungeons, the best tanks are warriors, druids, paladins, and sometimes shamans. Warriors are generally regarded as the best tanks. Even if you don't level protection spec, you can just equip a one-hander and a shield, stay in defensive stance most of the time, and be ready to tank. No real gear change required at all. Druids work very similarly, actually. Most druids level as feral anyway, so there's really no reason to swap gear or get specific talents to tank while leveling. Just hop in bear form and go. Now, paladins and shamans are kind of a special case. Paladins, unlike the others, have no real taunt ability, and making threat generation is kind of a pain. That said, if you pick up the Consecration talent in the Holy Tree at level 20, combined with their self-buff spell, Righteous Fury, you'll actually be a little bit better at AoE tanking than your other tank counterparts. Shamans, if geared well and with good talents, can tank pretty well, but it's definitely a job that requires a ton of effort, only to yield similar or same results as another class putting in minimal effort. Shamans have Rockbiter weapon enhancement to increase threat on melee attacks, and Earthshock as a sort of pseudo-taunt ability, something that even paladins don't have. Now in raiding, the only main tanks you'll end up seeing are warriors and druids. Paladins and shamans are just unfortunately suboptimal. Not unplayable, maybe as off tanks. I mean, it's been done before to some success, but it is suboptimal. We'll talk more about raiding next time. Moving on to healers, the classes that can heal are priests, druids, paladins, and shamans. A trend here maybe. So priests, just like warriors, can level as their normal leveling spec, whatever that may be, and still do their job amazingly as a healer with no change in gear. Druids, on the other hand, can heal just fine in the normal feral leveling spec, but you'll need at least a couple pieces of intellect, spirit, or spell power gear before you start healing. That said, you could also level as a balanced druid, treating yourself as this sort of nature mage who does damage and heals, and you won't have to swap gear at all in that case. Just make sure you can get yourself some water, because you'll be out of mana a lot. Paladins are kind of in the same boat as druids. You're going to need some intellect gear in order to heal well. On top of that though, paladins don't really become the amazing healers that they are until about level 30 when they have 5 points into the illumination talent. They can heal without holy talents by all means, but once you have 5 points in illumination, you'll never run out of mana while healing. It's awesome. Now, shamans are great healers as well, but I think in comparison to druids and paladins during leveling, they're not really as dependent on gear, and they're certainly not dependent on talents. Shamans naturally want some intellect to give them some mana and spell crit, even if they're leveling a two-hand or Wind Fury. That said, leveling as an elemental shaman is actually quite common, and they go for intellect gear anyways, in which case you wouldn't even have to worry about swapping gear out either. Word of advice though, if you do choose to level an elemental shaman, try to get nature spell damage or any kind of spell power gear as soon as possible. That goes for all caster DPS for that matter. Spell damage over all other stats. Now in raiding, you'll actually see an equal spread of all of these classes as healers. It's a general rule that the hybrid classes, paladins, shamans, and to a slightly lesser extent druids, are mostly resigned to healing roles. Again, if you want to break out of that healing role, it's not impossible, but you'll have to put in a massive amount of effort to reach the same potential as someone of a different class who'll put in minimal effort. The DPS role can be filled by, well, everyone. Everyone does DPS just fine, but in the case of a 5-man party, shouldn't we just try to figure out what the best DPS class is and get 3 of those? Well, actually, we'd rather diversify our group, and there are a few really good reasons why. Now, the first benefit of diversifying your DPS is having utility, which I'll define as the mechanics or features that are unique to a character or class that makes its usefulness nearly incomparable to other characters or classes. So sure, having 3 arms warriors will do a ton of damage, but we won't have much CC to prevent enemies from dealing damage. We won't have any range damage to counteract enemies being spread far apart or doing damage outside of AoEs. And we won't have a lot of AoE to counteract tons of enemies being contained in a small area, except for higher level warriors, then it's not so bad. I mean, these are just some examples. What about if you encounter water and you need to get across it quickly and get water walking from a shaman? Or what if you encounter a trap or a chest that you want to open up, but you don't have lockpicking because you don't have a rogue? On top of that, the second benefit to diversifying is for loot drops. See, all 3 of these warriors are now competing for the same gear that's going to be dropped in this dungeon. If you diversify your roster, say maybe a mage, a rogue, and a warrior, you now have a cloth wearer, a leather wearer, and a mail wearer. Everyone is looking for different gear, so no one is competing or losing out. And the third major benefit is that trying to find 3 characters all of the same supposed best damage dealing class would take longer than just finding 3 other DPS. Save some time, diversify. So we've talked about the 3 roles, tank, healer, and DPS, but I'd say that there's possibly even one more role, which I would call the hybrid role, at least as far as small encounters in dungeons are concerned. The hybrid's job is to sort of fill in the gaps on the fly. They'll do decent DPS until the tank loses aggro on a mob and can't control it, so then the hybrid steps in and off-tanks that mob. Or, let's say the healer is running low on mana or can't get to everyone who needs healing, the hybrid steps in and off-heals. The first class that should come to mind when you think of hybrids are druids. They are without a doubt the best hybrid in the game, jack of all trades, master of none kind of deal. Shamans and paladins, as you might guess, are also great hybrids. Now, we keep using this word utility, and I know I defined it earlier, but we should go more in depth about the different utility or benefits of bringing certain DPS to the party. Here I've split utility into 2 main types, preparatory and reactionary. Preparatory utility pertains to class buffs, items that can be handed out, and methods of aiding travel, so Arcane Intellect, Mark of the Wild, Powered Fortitude, Paladin Blessings, Shaman Totems, etc. These are all class buffs. Items would be things like Mage Food and Water, Warlock Health Stones, and Warlock Soul Stones. Travel utility would include things like Mage Portals, Warlock Summons, Underwater Breathing, Water Walking, etc. On top of this, there are also things that, personally, I'm not even sure how to classify, like Rogue Lockpicking and Resurrecting. They can lockpick boxes, rogues, they can lockpick chests, they can even disarm traps and open doors. Now, reactionary utility pertains to counter debuffing and CC, crowd control, or ways in which you can control and hinder your enemy. Counter debuffing, or probably better known as decursing, is removing debuffs on you and your allies. The term comes from the mage and druid spells Remove Curse, which removes a harmful curse on an ally, as you might imagine. But it also includes spells like Abolish Poison for the druids, Cure Disease for shamans, and Cleanse for paladins. If you remember last episode, we gave an example from Wailing Caverns where Druids of the Fang will cast Sleep on a random party member. One of the solutions I gave was Tremor Totem. That would fall under this decursing subcategory of reactionary utility. Moving on to crowd control, I've split this subcategory into hard CC and soft CC. Hard CC attempts to completely and reliably remove the enemy from the fight, usually before or at the beginning of the fight. Things like Polymorph and Sap are great examples of this, as they can keep an enemy incapacitated for up to about a minute. But Polymorph can only be used on humanoids and beasts. Sap can only be used on humanoids as well. So then we have these other forms of hard CC here that help fill in the blanks. Now moving on to soft CC. Soft CC is any other form of CC that prevents your opponent from doing damage in one way or another. This includes slow, daze, stun, root, fear, blind, disarm, interrupt, and silence. Slow, daze, and root are all movement impairing effects that don't affect the character's ability to attack. Stun, fear, and blind are movement impairing effects that do prevent the character from attacking. Interrupt prevents a spell from occurring only if it happens during the casting of the spell. Disarm prevents a character from auto-attacking with a weapon and from using spells that require a weapon. And Silence prevents a character from casting spells entirely. Wow, that was a lot. But what did we learn today? Well, we learned that we need a group to do a lot of stuff, especially dungeons. We learned what makes up a group, generally speaking, 1 tank, 1 healer, 3 DPS. And we learned that we want to diversify the DPS because, most importantly, 1, we would like a good spread of utility from each character, and 2, we would prefer no one be competing for the same loot. And speaking of utility, we just went over all of the different kinds, and boy is there a ton. So now, go forth into the world, type away in general chat, /1 LFG looking for group, or LFM looking for more. These acronyms will be quite useful. But, you know, I think we talked pretty much about everything a beginner will need to know at this point. Well, almost everything.